Hi, and welcome to English-Fabule. Are you learning English? Great. Let's learn English with a very interesting story. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Let's get started.
Introduction: The Man Who Changed a Country. Hello and welcome. Today we are going to learn about Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela is a name known around the world. He was a great leader who fought for what he believed in. He wasn't just important in his own country, South Africa, but he became a symbol of hope and freedom for many people. This book tells the story of his amazing life. South Africa, when Mandela was growing up, was a country with a big problem called apartheid. This meant that people were treated very differently because of their skin color. Black people had very few rights. They couldn't vote, they couldn't live where they wanted, and they were treated unfairly in almost every way. It was a very unjust system. This is the story of Nelson Mandela's journey. He started as a young boy in a small village. He went to school and learned about the world. He saw how unfair things were and decided to fight for change. He became a leader of the movement against apartheid. He spent many years in prison because of his beliefs, but he never gave up his fight for freedom. This story will explore how a young man from a small village became a world leader. How did he find the strength to fight against injustice for 27 long years in prison? How did he help his country become a better place? And what lessons can we all learn from his incredible life? Chapter 1: A Boy in the Village. Nelson Mandela was born a long time ago, in 1918. He wasn't born in a big city with tall buildings. He was born in a small village called Mvezo in South Africa. Mvezo was a quiet place, with rolling hills and green grass. It was a rural area far away from the busy towns. His family was part of the Xhosa people. The Xhosa people have a rich culture with their own language and traditions. Nelson's family were important people in the community. His father was a chief, which meant he was a leader. This was important because Nelson learned from his father about how to be strong and fair. When Nelson was born, his parents gave him the name Rolilala. It is a Xhosa name. In Xhosa, it means troublemaker, but in a fun way. Life was very different then for a young boy. There were no cars or electricity in the village. Instead, Nelson spent most of his time playing games with other children, taking care of the family's animals, and helping out in the fields. He grew up with his family around him. Nelson's mother was loving and very good at caring for him and his siblings. The family lived in traditional Xhosa homes, which were small round huts made of mud and grass. Life was simple, but it was full of traditions. The Xhosa people often told stories around the fire at night, teaching the children about their history and values. Nelson loved these stories, and they helped him understand who he was and where he came from. He learned to respect his elders and the wisdom they had. When Nelson was about 7 years old, his life started to change. He began to go to a local school, a little mission school run by Christian people. Here he learned new things. He was given a new name too. His teacher decided to call him Nelson. This was a very common name for the English speakers. Going to school was very different from his time at home. In his village, he was free to run and play. At school, he had to sit still and learn new things from books. He learned to read and write, and he was good at his studies. But sometimes he got bored with lessons. He also started to learn about different people who lived in towns far away from the village. Even as a young boy, Nelson showed that he was not like the other children. He was not afraid to speak his mind and ask questions. He had a strong will, and he didn't always agree with what he was told. He liked to do things his own way, and sometimes he would get into trouble for it. For example, he might ask a lot of questions that others didn't feel comfortable asking. This independence of spirit was the beginning of the man he would later become. In Mvezo, Nelson was a boy who loved playing games and learning about the world. He was part of his community and followed the Xhosa ways. But he was also a boy who wanted more and had an independent mind. His early life in the village laid the foundation for his journey to becoming a leader. This is where his story begins. It shows us that even in a simple place, someone can grow up to change the world. Chapter 2. School and New Ideas. Nelson Mandela was a bright boy. After his early years in Mvezo, it was time for him to go to a bigger school. This school was called Hilltown. It was a place where many young Xhosa people went to learn. Hilltown was a long way from his village, and it was very different. It was a Wesleyan college, which meant it was run by a church group. At Hilltown, Nelson studied many subjects. He learned about English, maths, and history. He was a good student and worked hard, but he also started to see things differently. He began to understand that the world was not fair. He saw that black people in South Africa were not treated the same as white people. This was called racial injustice. It meant that people were treated badly because of the color of their skin. Nelson was learning about the history of the world, and he saw that black people had not always been treated unfairly. He learned about other countries where people were free and equal. He started to think about how South Africa could be better. He felt angry about the unfairness he saw every day. After Hilltown, Nelson went to a bigger university called Fort Hare. He was excited to learn more. However, at Fort Hare, he got into trouble. He was part of a student protest. The students were angry about the way the university was run. Nelson was one of the leaders of the protest. Because of this, he was told to leave the university. He was expelled. This means he was not allowed to come back to study there. This was a big disappointment for Nelson, but he did not give up. He left Fort Hare and went to Johannesburg. Johannesburg was a big city, very different from his village and the school. In Johannesburg, Nelson saw even more clearly how black people were treated in South Africa. He saw that they had to live in poor areas. They had to do the hardest jobs. They did not have the same rights as white people. He saw many people struggling to live. They were poor and did not have good homes. They were often treated badly by white people. Nelson felt a strong need to do something about this. He wanted to help his people. He wanted to make things fair. In Johannesburg, Nelson met many other young African people who felt the same way. They were angry about the unfairness they saw. They talked about how to make things better. Nelson was learning a lot, not just in books, but from the lives of the people around him. He was starting to understand that he needed to fight for change. He was beginning to find his path. Chapter 3. Joining the fight. After his time at university and the experiences he had in Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela knew he could not stay silent. He saw how unfairly black people were treated in South Africa. He wanted to do something to change it. He started to get more involved in politics. One important group was the African National Congress, or ANC. The ANC was a political organization that wanted equal rights for all people in South Africa, no matter their skin color. Mandela joined the ANC because he believed in their ideas. He thought they could help make a difference. At this time, the ANC was not very active. Some younger members, including Mandela, thought the ANC needed to do more. They wanted to be stronger and fight harder against the unfair laws. So, they created a new group inside the ANC called the ANC Youth League. The ANC Youth League was very important. It pushed the ANC to be more active and use stronger tactics. Mandela was a key leader in the Youth League. He helped to organize protests and meetings. He was a very good speaker and could convince people to join the fight. He was becoming more and more important within the ANC. During this time, Nelson Mandela also met a woman named Evelyn Mays. Evelyn was a nurse, and they fell in love. They got married and started a family. Life was busy for Mandela. He was working hard for the ANC and also starting his family life. The South African government was not happy with the ANC's growing power. They made even more laws to control black people. The ANC decided to fight back. They organized a big campaign called the Defiance Campaign. The Defiance Campaign was a series of peaceful protests. People broke unfair laws on purpose, like using white-only facilities. They did this to show the government that they would not accept the unfair laws any longer. Mandela was very involved in organizing these protests. He was arrested several times for his actions, but this did not stop him. He believed it was important to keep fighting. He was becoming a leader for his people. He was not just a young man anymore. He was a man with a mission. He was ready to fight for what was right, even if it meant facing danger. His time working with the ANC Youth League and the Defiance Campaign showed everyone how strong and determined he was. He was no longer just a student. He was a political activist, ready to change South Africa. Chapter 4. The Treason Trial. Life in South Africa was becoming more difficult. The government was using more power to stop people who wanted change. They did not like people who fought against apartheid. Nelson Mandela and many of his friends in the ANC were now seen as enemies of the country. One morning, in December 1956, the police came. They arrested Nelson and more than 150 other leaders and activists. It was a big shock for everyone. These people were important in the fight for equality. The government said they were planning to overthrow the country. They called it treason, which is a very serious crime. The trial was very long. It lasted for many years. It was called the Treason Trial. The government tried to show that Nelson and the others were dangerous and wanted to use violence to change things. Nelson and his lawyers had to work very hard to defend themselves. They showed that they were fighting for justice and equality, not for violence. Nelson was a strong and smart defendant. He was always calm and respectful in the court. He used his words to explain the problems of apartheid and why people needed to fight for change. He showed that his ideas were about making South Africa a better place for everyone, not just for white people. He used the trial as a chance to teach people about the ANC's ideas. During this difficult time, Nelson's personal life also changed. He had married Winnie Madikizela. She was a strong and brave woman who supported him and the fight against apartheid. They had 2 daughters together. It was hard for Nelson to be away from his family for so long. He worried about them. Winnie had to take care of the family and also fight for her husband's freedom. The treason trial was very difficult for Nelson, his friends, and their families. The court case took up a lot of time and it was expensive. It made it hard for them to do other things. But they did not give up hope. They kept fighting for what they believed in. After many years, the court finally made a decision. The judge said that the government had not shown that Nelson and the other activists were guilty of treason. All the defendants were found not guilty. It was a big victory for Nelson and his friends. They were free to go home. Even though they won this case, the fight was not over. The government was still very powerful. They would continue to try and stop anyone who fought against apartheid. But the treason trial had showed people that Nelson Mandela and the ANC were not criminals. They were people fighting for a better future for all South Africans. They would continue to be an important part of the fight for justice. The trial had made Nelson even more determined to fight for freedom. Chapter 5. Going Underground. The year 1960 was a very sad year for South Africa. Something terrible happened in a place called Sharpeville. Many black people were protesting peacefully against unfair laws. Police came and shot at them. Many people died, including women and children. This event is now known as the Sharpeville Massacre. This event changed everything. For a long time, the African National Congress, ANC, had tried to fight apartheid peacefully. They had meetings, they had marches, but the government didn't listen. After Sharpeville, many people in the ANC thought it was time to fight back in a different way. They felt that peaceful protest was not working anymore. So, the ANC decided to create a new group. This group was called Umkhonto weSizwe, or MK for short. This means Spear of the Nation in Xhosa. MK was the armed wing of the ANC. It was created to use force, like bombs and attacks, against the government. They were going to try to make the government change their ways by making it difficult for them to stay in power. Nelson Mandela became a leader in MK. He was now a wanted man by the government. He could not live at home with his family anymore. He had to go into hiding. This meant he had to live a secret life. He used different names and moved from place to place. He had to be very careful so that the police wouldn't find him. He became a master of disguise. He sometimes dressed as a chauffeur, a gardener, or a farmer. This way he could move around without being noticed. Life underground was very difficult. He missed his wife, Winnie, and his children very much. He was working hard for the freedom of his people, but he had to be separate from his family. It was a very hard sacrifice for him. Mandela also knew that the ANC needed help from other countries. He decided to travel abroad secretly. He went to countries in Africa and in Europe. He spoke to leaders and asked them to support the fight against apartheid. He asked for money and for weapons to help MK. He explained the terrible situation in South Africa and tried to get the world to understand how unfair apartheid was. These travels were very dangerous, but Mandela knew they were important. He had to show the world what was happening in South Africa. During this time, Mandela became known as the Black Pimpernel because he was so good at hiding from the police. He was always one step ahead of them. He was becoming a symbol of resistance, a man who would not give up the fight. The Sharpeville massacre and the formation of MK were very big changes for Mandela and for the ANC. They had moved away from peaceful protests and were now ready to fight with force. This was a very dangerous time, but Mandela believed it was necessary to end apartheid. He was willing to take risks and make great sacrifices for the freedom of his people. He was now leading the fight from the shadows, hoping to bring light to South Africa. Chapter 6. Arrest and Trial. After hiding for a long time, things changed for Nelson Mandela. The police were looking for him everywhere. He was known as the Black Pimpernel because he was good at hiding. He was moving around, meeting people, and helping the ANC. But his time on the run was going to end. One day, in August 1962, the police finally caught him. They stopped his car near Howick, a small town in South Africa. It was a big moment. Mandela knew it was dangerous, but he had to keep fighting for his people. He was arrested and taken to prison. It was a difficult time for him and his family. After his arrest, Mandela was put on trial. It was called the Rivonia trial because the police found important papers at a place called Rivonia, a farm outside of Johannesburg. These papers showed that Mandela and others were planning to fight against the government. The government charged Mandela and his friends with serious crimes, like trying to take over the country by force. They said he was a dangerous person. The trial was held in Pretoria, a big city in South Africa. The whole world was watching. The trial was very important for the anti-apartheid movement. During the trial, Mandela spoke clearly and strongly. He didn't try to hide anything. He told the court why he was fighting against apartheid. He said that the government was treating black people unfairly and that he wanted a country where everyone was equal. He spoke about his beliefs and how he wanted a better future for South Africa. His words were very powerful. He talked about the terrible things that were happening because of apartheid and how he felt he had no other choice but to fight it. His speech was long, but everyone listened carefully. It became very famous. People all over the world heard about it. He said, "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The judges listened, but they did not change their minds. They decided that Mandela and his friends were guilty. In June 1964, they gave Mandela a life sentence. This meant he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The news of Mandela's life sentence was terrible for his family and his supporters. His wife Winnie was very brave and kept fighting for his release. People around the world were very angry. They started to protest against the South African government. The anti-apartheid movement grew even stronger. Many people now understood the terrible things that were happening in South Africa. Even though Mandela was in prison, his words and his fight inspired people to keep working for change. The fight against apartheid was far from over. Mandela's arrest and trial were a huge blow, but also a turning point in the struggle for freedom. Chapter 7. Years in Prison. Nelson Mandela's life changed completely after the trial. He was sent to Robben Island, a prison on a small island near Cape Town. This place was very different from the world he knew. Robben Island was a hard place. The prison was cold and gray. The conditions were very bad. Mandela and the other prisoners lived in small cells. They slept on thin mats on the floor. The food was not good, and there was never enough. They worked long hours in a stone quarry, breaking rocks in the hot sun. It was very hard work. The guards were often cruel and treated them badly. They did not have much freedom. But Mandela did not give up. He was a strong man. He tried to keep his mind active. He read books when he could. He talked to the other prisoners. They shared their ideas and their hopes for the future. Mandela became a leader for the other prisoners. He helped them to stay strong and to keep their spirits up. They supported each other. He knew that the world outside was still fighting for their freedom. He knew that people everywhere were saying, "Free Nelson Mandela." This gave him hope. Life was hard for Mandela's family too. His wife Winnie also became a powerful activist. She kept the fight for freedom alive outside the prison. She visited Nelson when she could, but visits were short and difficult. He missed his children very much and worried about them. It was painful not to be with his family, but he knew why he was in prison. He was fighting for freedom for all people in South Africa. After some years on Robben Island, Mandela was moved to other prisons. The conditions were sometimes a little better, but prison was still hard. Even in prison, Mandela continued to inspire people. His ideas and his strength were very important for the anti-apartheid movement. He became a symbol of the fight against racism and injustice. Mandela spent many years in prison. He was there for more than 27 years. It was an unbelievably long time to be away from his family and friends, but he never forgot his goal. He never stopped believing that one day South Africa would be free. He never gave up hope. He stayed strong, and he continued to lead, even from inside his prison cell. His time in prison was a very difficult test, but he passed it with courage and strength. He did not let the prison break his spirit. He believed that he would see freedom one day. Chapter 8. Free Nelson Mandela. The world was changing. Nelson Mandela was still in prison, but things were different now. Many people around the world knew his name. They knew he was a leader fighting against unfair rules in South Africa. These unfair rules were called apartheid. People everywhere were angry about apartheid. They didn't think it was right to treat people differently because of the color of their skin. They started to ask their own governments to do something. They wanted Mandela to be free. This led to a big movement called Free Nelson Mandela. People had posters, wore T-shirts, and sang songs. They held protests in the streets. Famous musicians even wrote songs about him. The world was shouting for Mandela's release. Countries also put pressure on the South African government. They stopped buying South African products. This hurt the South African economy. It made the government think about what they were doing. Inside South Africa, things were changing too. More and more people were protesting. It was becoming harder for the government to control everything. They knew they needed to talk to Mandela. So secret talks started. Government officials would visit Mandela in prison. They talked about the future of South Africa. It was the start of a difficult conversation, but it was a conversation that needed to happen. These talks were very important. They were a sign that things were finally changing. The South African government was also changing. The old leaders were starting to see that apartheid couldn't last. They started to think about new ways to run the country. They knew they had to talk to Mandela and the ANC to make a peaceful change. These secret meetings were very important. They were difficult, but they were also hopeful. Mandela, even though he was in prison, was still a strong leader. He was a big part of the change that was coming. The world kept watching. They kept demanding his release. They knew that freeing Mandela was a big step towards ending apartheid. The Free Nelson Mandela movement was working. People were hopeful. They knew that change was coming to South Africa soon. Chapter 9. A New South Africa. The world held its breath. After so many years, Nelson Mandela was finally free. On the 11th of February, 1990, the prison gates opened. A man walked out, older but still strong, and the world cheered. It was a moment of hope, a moment that many thought they would never see. Nelson Mandela was no longer just a political prisoner. He was now a symbol. He was a symbol of freedom, of courage, and of fighting for what is right. When he walked out of prison, he knew his work was not finished. He now had a new job, to help build a new South Africa, a country for all people, not just some. The years that followed were not easy. There were many challenges. The old government, the one that had kept black people down for so long, was still there. Many people were angry and scared. They didn't trust each other. It was a difficult time to start again. Mandela understood that talking was the best way forward. He met with government leaders, the very people who had put him in prison. He talked with them about a new future, a future where everyone was equal. He did not want revenge. He wanted peace. These talks were called negotiations. They were long and hard, with many arguments. Some people in the ANC wanted to fight. They wanted to get back at the people who had hurt them. Mandela had to persuade them that this was not the way. He spoke about forgiveness and working together. This was not easy, but he showed that it was possible. There were many compromises. This means that neither side got everything they wanted. But Mandela and others found a way to make things better. They agreed to create a new government where everyone could vote. This was a big change, as before only white people could vote. Finally, on the 27th of April, 1994, South Africa had its first democratic elections. People of all races stood in long lines to vote. It was a very special day. Nelson Mandela voted for the first time in his life. It was a powerful moment. The ANC won the election, and Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa. It was a huge victory for him and for all the people who had fought for freedom. When Mandela became president, the country celebrated. It was a new day for South Africa. Mandela's inauguration, the ceremony where he officially became president, was a very special event. People from all over the world came to see it. Mandela stood on the stage, smiling and waving to the people. He promised that he would be a president for all South Africans. not just for some. He started the difficult task of building a country where everyone felt safe and respected. It was the start of a new chapter for South Africa, a chapter of freedom and equality. Chapter 10. Life After Power. Nelson Mandela was now the president of South Africa. He had done something amazing. He helped to end apartheid. He showed the world that peace was possible, but being president was hard work. He was old, and he had been in prison for a long time. He knew that he could not be president forever. After 5 years, Mandela decided not to be president again. Some people were surprised. They thought he should stay in power, but Mandela believed it was time for a new leader. He wanted South Africa to be a true democracy. He knew that leaders should not stay in power too long. Even after he stopped being president, Mandela did not stop working. He became a global statesman. This means he traveled the world. He spoke to leaders and people everywhere. He talked about peace, justice, and human rights. He was a symbol of hope for many. Mandela still cared very much about South Africa. He wanted all South Africans to live together in peace. He worked hard to bring people together. He believed that everyone should be treated with respect. He encouraged people to forgive each other. He knew that a new South Africa needed healing. One big problem in South Africa was HIV, AIDS. This disease was making many people sick and die. Mandela spoke out about this problem. He wanted people to learn about HIV, AIDS. He wanted the government to do more to help people. He used his influence to raise awareness. He wanted to help people who had the disease. As Mandela grew older, he became less active. He was very tired. He spent more time with his family and friends. He still followed the news and gave advice sometimes. People all over the world admired him. They remembered him as a hero. Nelson Mandela died in 2013. People were very sad, but they also celebrated his life. They remembered all the amazing things he had done. He showed that one person can change the world. He left behind a legacy of peace, forgiveness, and equality. Today, people still learn from his life. He will always be remembered as a great leader. His story will continue to inspire people to fight for what is right. He showed the world that even after the hardest times, there is always hope for a better future.
Hey there! Just a second before you go. If you learned something new today, please give this video a like, write your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. It only takes a second, and it really, really helps to create even better English videos for you. Your support means the world. Thank you.